Now that I've basted my collar to my bodice, it's time to do the facings. I will be following our directions for facings. The first step is to apply the interfacing to the front and back facing sections. Then you stitch the shoulder seams together and press them open. It is not necessary to seam finish these seams because they will not be exposed. Then finish the unnotched edge of the facing 1/4 inch from the edge. This will be our pressing guide to finish our edge. The next step is to press the edge to the wrong side of the stitching line. Stitch close to the folded edge. This is similar to the clean finished edge and the turned and stitch edge we did for a seam finish. And you can see that it's been stitched down on this side. Now that we have our facing ready, we can apply it. With right sides together, we're going to pin this and we're going to match our shoulder seams. Match our shoulder seams. We'll match to the edge, and it's a little bit longer because we've already done our zipper. We will take care of that. Come around to the other side and match this shoulder seam. And the edge, match your notches. So it is supposed to be longer. I'll put a pin right in the center. And then it's ready to sew at 5/8 of an inch. This is a regular seam allowance and a regular stitch. So we'll stitch that on. Then it's necessary, and I'll just show you some samples now. Once you stitch that, it's necessary to grade your seam allowances. And you can see here, because I have two different colors, grade your seam allowances. The facing, which you grade smaller, is to 1/4 inch, that's the blue, and the muslin piece is to 3/8 of an inch, and then you want to press your seams flat. Then it's time to understitch. And understitching is a line of straight stitching applied along the seam line to keep the facing and seam allowances lying flat. When you do that, the first thing you do is press your seam flat, and then you grade your seam, and you can see that my facing seam is the narrower, and you press all of your seam allowances up and away from the garment toward the facing. Then you do a line of understitching, and the line of understitching catches just the seam allowances and the facing, not the garment. So you do a line of stitching about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Okay, you can see that the garment is not caught at all, and you can see that line of stitching. And my seam allowances are here. And the reason you do that, see how nicely that lays down, that keeps your facing from flipping out to the right side of the garment. So understitching is one type of stitching that we do when we do a facing. The armhole facing is done exactly the same way, except that you sew together and form a circle both of your facing pieces, the front and back. Once again, these seam allowances don't need to be stitched, and you turn and stitch so you have a finished edge, and then you would apply that to the armhole. One more assignment that you have today here is the sheet for understitching, top stitching, and edge stitching, because those are 3 different types of stitching that you will do, and we'll just go over those briefly. We just did edge stitching, which holds down your facing, and then you have top stitching. Top stitching and edge stitching are decorative stitching, which do show on the right side of the garment. Understitching does not show. Top stitching is wider, and that's the sample right here. This is top stitching. This is wider. And then you have edge stitching. And to obtain the best results, you want to use a straight stitch and a presser foot with a single hole needle. Now, when you do the top stitching, you want to sew a regular seam and press it open. And then from the right side, you want to top stitch 1/4 inch down each side of the seam. Sometimes if you use a longer stitch length, it looks a little bit nicer and it stands out. So this would be top stitching. Both sides are sewed. Edge stitching is a little bit different. You sew a regular seam, press it open, and then press it to one side. You can see that all the seam allowance is over here. And then from the right side, you stitch approximately 1/8 inch from the edge. So those are three different types of stitching that you'll do. Try not to confuse them. I think when you're using them, you'll know which one to use.